A series of immigration raids sweeping across Southern California. Civil rights groups say at least 20 ICE operations taking place from East LA to downtown, including this one in Montebello. Cameras catching agents climbing onto a roof to chase construction workers there. Eyewitness News reporter Abigail Velez live tonight with what neighbors saw and how the workers involved are responding. Abigail?
Well, Mark, they tell me it was a chaotic scene. This is the neighborhood where ICE came swarming in this morning, eventually climbing onto the roof of a home and chasing construction workers as those workers bounced from house to house. I spoke to the workers' boss, and he tells me that no one was detained, but those workers now are afraid to come back to work. And the neighbors we spoke to in this area tell me they feel equally as nervous. Surveillance video shows the moment ICE agents arrive at this Montebello home Wednesday morning. An unmarked truck pulls up on Wilbur Street. Agents jump out. They fan around the house, and within seconds, one of them is climbing a ladder onto the roof. The construction workers up there run, jumping from roof to roof, trying to get away. No one is detained, but the fear is immediate and obvious.
They were just scared, actually, just feared for their lives. I mean, they didn't know what was happening.
The man who hired the crew, a contractor named Manny, says he rushed over when he heard what happened. He found his crew nervous and scared, so he did the only thing he could think to do.
We just gathered, and I prayed for all of them, and I prayed for their protection, and that God would just give us peace during this troubled time.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to take a careful, calm, and very deliberate look at a moment that, on the surface, may appear to be just another immigration enforcement operation, but when you slow it down, when you examine it frame by frame, it becomes something much larger. Something that raises questions not just about immigration policy, but about fear, authority, law, and the lived reality of entire communities. What unfolded in Southern California was not announced ahead of time. It wasn't accompanied by press releases or official briefings. Instead, it arrived suddenly, without warning, in residential neighborhoods where people were simply trying to work, live, and get through an ordinary day. Cameras captured federal immigration agents climbing onto rooftops, chasing construction workers as they moved from house to house, trying to escape a situation they did not fully understand in the moment. And before we go any further, it's important to set expectations clearly. This analysis is not about cheering for one side or condemning another. It is about understanding what happened, why it happened, what the legal framework actually allows, and how moments like this affect real people on the ground. Because once fear enters a neighborhood, it does not stay neatly contained within the boundaries of a single enforcement action. According to reporting from local news outlets, civil rights groups estimate that at least 20 separate ICE operations took place across Southern California in a single day. These operations stretched from East Los Angeles to downtown areas, including communities like Montebello. In one of the most widely circulated videos, agents arrived in an unmarked vehicle on a residential street. Within seconds, they surrounded a home where construction work was underway. One agent climbed a ladder onto the roof, and suddenly, the scene escalated. Construction workers who had been performing routine labor found themselves running, not because they had been formally detained, not because warrants were publicly presented on camera, but because fear took over. They moved across rooftops, jumping between structures, reacting instinctively to what felt like a sudden and overwhelming threat. What stands out immediately in this footage is not just the physical movement of agents and workers, but the emotional intensity of the moment. Neighbors later described the scene as chaotic, disorienting, alarming. For many watching from their windows, it was not immediately clear who was being targeted, why, or how far the situation might go. The contractor who hired the crew arrived after hearing what had happened. He did not find his workers in handcuffs. No one had been officially detained. But what he found instead was something that doesn't show up in arrest statistics: fear. Deep, visible fear. Workers shaken to the point where some said they were afraid to return to work at all. In response, the contractor gathered the crew together and prayed with them. That moment is easy to overlook if you focus only on enforcement metrics. But it matters, because it illustrates how these operations ripple outward. They do not only affect the individuals ICE intends to question or detain, they affect co-workers, families, neighbors, and entire neighborhoods who witness these events and begin asking themselves a simple question: could this happen to me next? And this was not an isolated scene. Video from other parts of Southern California that same day shows agents confronting and detaining people in public spaces, near businesses, on sidewalks, in areas where daily life normally unfolds without interruption. Advocacy organizations argue that the scope of these operations is expanding and that communities are being left to navigate the consequences largely on their own. One organizer described what they see as an escalation, not just in frequency but in intensity. They argue that the tactics being used, rapid deployment, unmarked vehicles, sudden confrontations, create an atmosphere of fear that extends far beyond any individual enforcement action. From their perspective, this is not simply about immigration law. It is about power, visibility, and the psychological impact of enforcement carried out in highly public, highly disruptive ways. At the same time, there is a critical legal layer that cannot be ignored. ICE agents are federal officers. That distinction matters. California has passed laws intended to increase accountability, including requirements that agents not cover their faces during operations. The goal, at least on paper, is transparency so that individuals know who is detaining them and under what authority. But here is where the tension becomes clear. Federal agents are not bound in the same way by state and local laws. Advocacy groups argue that these state-level protections become symbolic rather than practical when federal authorities are involved. In their view, laws meant to reassure communities lose their power when enforcement agencies can simply bypass them under federal jurisdiction. Meanwhile, in towns like Montebello, neighbors say their daily routines have changed. Some are thinking twice before leaving their homes. Others worry about relatives who now hesitate to go outside at all. Fear doesn't require detention to take hold. Sometimes the presence of enforcement alone is enough. Local officials have attempted to respond with statements emphasizing their commitment to protecting residents and public spaces. However, details remain limited. Questions about how many operations took place, who was targeted, and whether those individuals had criminal backgrounds have not yet been fully answered. Requests for clarification from federal agencies have, so far, gone unanswered. And that lack of information is not a small detail. In situations like this, uncertainty becomes its own force. When people don't know why enforcement is happening, who it applies to, or how long it will continue, rumors fill the gaps. Anxiety spreads faster than verified facts. This brings us to the larger issue at the heart of this story. Immigration enforcement has always existed in a space where law, politics, and human experience collide. But moments like this, agents on rooftops, workers fleeing, neighborhoods watching in silence, force a broader conversation. Not about abstract policy debates in Washington, but about how enforcement looks and feels when it arrives at someone's front door. And this is where we need to slow down even more, because what happens next depends not only on policy decisions, but on perception, on trust, on whether communities believe the system is acting within clear legal boundaries or operating in ways that feel unpredictable and frightening. In the next part, we're going to zoom out. We'll examine why Southern California, why now, and how federal immigration enforcement strategies have shifted over time. We'll also look at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, and where the lines, clear or blurred, are supposed to be drawn. Because this story isn't just about one roof, one street, or one neighborhood. It's about what happens when enforcement, fear, and uncertainty collide in public view. As we move deeper into this story, it's important to understand that what happened in Montebello and other parts of Southern California did not emerge in a vacuum. Immigration enforcement does not suddenly intensify without a broader political, legal, and strategic backdrop shaping when, where, and how these operations unfold. Southern California has long been a focal point of immigration enforcement for a simple reason: population density, economic activity, and long-established immigrant communities intersect here in a way few other regions can match. Construction sites, service industries, and residential labor markets rely heavily on immigrant workers, both documented and undocumented. That reality has always placed these communities at the center of enforcement debates, regardless of which administration is in power. But what many residents are reacting to now is not merely the existence of enforcement, it's the style of enforcement, the visibility, the suddenness, and the sense that lines once considered informal boundaries, private property, residential neighborhoods, places of routine labor, are no longer acting as buffers between daily life and federal authority. In previous eras, large-scale ICE operations were often framed as targeted actions focused on individuals with serious criminal records. Whether that framing matched reality is a separate debate. What matters here is perception. When enforcement appears focused, communities may feel uneasy but not paralyzed. When enforcement appears broad, fast, and unpredictable, fear becomes generalized. In the Montebello incident, no one was ultimately detained, yet the emotional impact was profound. That alone tells us something critical. Enforcement does not require arrests to reshape behavior. The presence of agents, the act of pursuit, and the uncertainty surrounding intent are enough to alter how people live, work, and move through their own neighborhoods. This is where civil rights organizations enter the picture. Groups monitoring these operations argue that the cumulative effect is what matters most. 20 operations in a single day, spread across multiple cities, send a message whether intended or not. That message is not delivered through official statements. It's delivered visually, through videos shared on phones, security footage replayed online, and stories passed from neighbor to neighbor. From their perspective, these raids create a chilling effect. Workers stay home. Families avoid public spaces. Entire communities begin operating under the assumption that any normal activity could suddenly become dangerous. That's not a legal judgment, it's a sociological reality. At the same time, federal authorities operate under a different framework entirely. ICE does not publicly comment on every operation. Enforcement priorities are often described in broad terms, emphasizing national security, public safety, and adherence to federal law. From that viewpoint, these operations are lawful exercises of authority, not spectacles designed to intimidate. And this is where the conflict deepens, because legality and legitimacy are not always experienced the same way by those on the receiving end. Something can be legal and still feel arbitrary, lawful and still feel destabilizing. The issue of identification and accountability further complicates matters. California's attempts to regulate how ICE agents present themselves reflect a broader push toward transparency. The idea is simple. If enforcement must occur, it should at least be clearly identifiable and accountable. Masks removed, badges visible, lines of authority unmistakable. But federal supremacy means those rules don't always apply. And when residents see agents arriving in unmarked vehicles, faces partially covered, actions unfolding quickly, trust erodes even faster. People don't have time to process legal nuance in the moment. They react to what they see. This dynamic is not theoretical. It shows up in how communities behave afterward. Neighbors in Montebello reported hesitating before leaving their homes. Workers reconsidered returning to job sites. These are not political statements. They are survival instincts. And survival instincts don't differentiate between documented status, undocumented status, or legal protections. Fear spreads indiscriminately. This is why local officials often find themselves trapped between two forces. On one side, federal authority they cannot override. On the other, residents demanding reassurance, protection, and clarity. Statements promising support sound comforting, but without concrete enforcement power, they risk being perceived as hollow. Meanwhile, the absence of clear information from federal agencies only intensifies the uncertainty. When officials do not disclose how many operations occurred, who was targeted, or under what criteria, speculation fills the void. And speculation is rarely calm or restrained. It's also important to understand that these operations are happening in a broader national climate, where immigration remains one of the most emotionally charged political issues. Every enforcement action is immediately interpreted through partisan lenses, amplified online, and often stripped of nuance. But on the ground, the experience is not abstract. It is immediate. A ladder against a roof, boots on shingles, workers running, neighbors watching. At this point, the question is no longer just what happened, but what happens next. Will enforcement continue at this pace? Will tactics change? Will communities adapt, resist, or retreat further into silence? And perhaps most importantly, how does a society balance the enforcement of federal law with the preservation of trust in public life? In the next section, we're going to look closely at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, what agents are allowed to do, where their power stops, and where misconceptions often arise. Because understanding the law is the first step toward understanding whether fear is being driven by reality, perception, or a mix of both. In the next part, we're going to zoom out. We'll examine why Southern California, why now, and how federal immigration enforcement strategies have shifted over time. We'll also look at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, and where the lines, clear or blurred, are supposed to be drawn. Because this story isn't just about one roof, one street, or one neighborhood. It's about what happens when enforcement, fear, and uncertainty collide in public view. To really understand why incidents like the Montebello raid generate such intense reactions, we need to slow things down and examine the legal framework that governs immigration enforcement in the United States. Because much of the fear surrounding these operations exists in the space between what ICE is legally authorized to do and what people believe it can do in the moment. ICE agents operate under federal authority. That means their powers come from federal statutes and federal court rulings, not state or local law. This distinction is critical. While states like California can pass laws designed to regulate cooperation, transparency, or conduct within their borders, those laws do not override federal enforcement authority. That's why state-level rules, such as restrictions on face coverings or requirements for identification, often collide with the practical reality of federal supremacy. However, federal authority is not unlimited. ICE agents do not have blanket permission to enter any property, detain anyone at any time, or pursue individuals without legal justification. Their authority is structured, conditional, and, at least on paper, constrained by constitutional protections. For example, entering a private residence generally requires consent or a judicial warrant signed by a judge. Administrative warrants issued by ICE itself do not grant automatic entry into homes. This distinction is frequently misunderstood, especially in chaotic moments when people are unsure of their rights and fearful of confrontation. In the Montebello incident, the enforcement activity occurred around a private home where construction workers were present on the roof. That detail matters. The roof, while elevated and visible, is still part of a private structure. The legal justification for agents climbing onto it would depend on specific circumstances that have not been publicly clarified, such as whether agents believed they had probable cause, whether consent was given, or whether exigent circumstances were claimed. And that uncertainty is part of the problem. When enforcement actions unfold rapidly and without explanation, the public is left guessing about legality. People don't know whether agents are acting within bounds or pushing them. And when people don't know, fear fills the gap. This is compounded by the fact that immigration law itself is among the most complex areas of U.S. law. It combines civil and criminal elements, administrative procedures, federal court rulings, and discretionary enforcement priorities that can shift between administrations. Even trained attorneys debate its boundaries. Expecting construction workers, neighbors, or bystanders to parse these distinctions in real time is unrealistic. Another source of confusion lies in the concept of targeted operations. Federal agencies often state that enforcement actions are directed at specific individuals, but when agents fan out across neighborhoods, question multiple people, and create visible disruption, the distinction between targeted enforcement and generalized presence becomes blurred. The experience on the ground feels indiscriminate, even if the paperwork says otherwise. This is why civil rights organizations focus less on the legality of individual arrests and more on the broader pattern of behavior. Their concern is not just who gets detained, but how enforcement affects communities collectively. Fear, in their view, is not an accidental side effect. It is a predictable outcome of visible, forceful operations in residential areas. From ICE's perspective, visibility can serve a different purpose. Public enforcement demonstrates authority. It signals that laws are being enforced. It deters future violations. These goals are not unique to immigration enforcement. They exist throughout the criminal justice system. The tension arises because deterrence for one group can feel like intimidation to another. This is where federal and local priorities often diverge. Local officials are accountable to residents who want safety, stability, and predictability. Federal agencies answer to national mandates, congressional oversight, and executive branch policy goals. When those priorities clash, communities become the pressure point. Another important legal layer involves detention and questioning. ICE agents may approach individuals in public spaces and ask questions. Individuals are generally not required to answer questions about immigration status without legal counsel present. However, in the moment, asserting that right can feel risky, especially for people who fear that any interaction could escalate. This dynamic explains why many workers flee rather than engage. It is not necessarily an admission of unlawful status. It is a calculation driven by fear, language barriers, and lack of trust in outcomes. And when people run, enforcement escalates. Chases begin. Physical pursuit creates visual drama. That drama then becomes the defining image of the operation, regardless of whether anyone is detained. From a legal standpoint, this creates a feedback loop. Enforcement actions provoke fear-driven responses. Those responses justify more aggressive enforcement tactics. And the cycle repeats. The question policymakers rarely address directly is whether this cycle actually achieves its stated goals. Does it improve compliance? Does it increase public safety? Or does it simply push vulnerable populations further into the shadows, making communities harder to police and less likely to cooperate with authorities? There is no simple answer, but the consequences are visible. In Montebello, no arrests were made, yet workers stopped showing up. Neighbors became afraid to leave their homes. Community trust declined. From a purely enforcement-based metric, the operation did not produce results. From a broader societal perspective, it reshaped behavior, and that may be the most significant impact of all. In the next section, we'll zoom out even further and examine the political timing of these operations, the national debate they feed into, and why moments like this often signal broader shifts in enforcement strategy rather than isolated incidents. In the next section, we're going to look closely at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, what agents are allowed to do, where their power stops, and where misconceptions often arise. Because understanding the law is the first step toward understanding whether fear is being driven by reality, perception, or a mix of both. In the next part, we're going to zoom out. We'll examine why Southern California, why now, and how federal immigration enforcement strategies have shifted over time. We'll also look at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, and where the lines, clear or blurred, are supposed to be drawn. Because this story isn't just about one roof, one street, or one neighborhood. It's about what happens when enforcement, fear, and uncertainty collide in public view. To understand why scenes like the one in Montebello are happening now, we have to step back and look at timing. Immigration enforcement does not operate in a political vacuum. Even when officials insist decisions are purely operational, the broader climate inevitably shapes priorities, visibility, and intensity. The United States is in a period of heightened political sensitivity around immigration. Public opinion is deeply divided, national elections are approaching, and immigration has once again become one of the most emotionally charged issues in American politics. In moments like this, enforcement actions take on symbolic weight far beyond their immediate legal purpose. For federal authorities, visible enforcement can serve as a signal. It communicates resolve. It reassures constituencies that laws are being enforced. It demonstrates control in a policy area, often criticized as chaotic or ineffective. From that perspective, operations like these are not just about individual cases. They are about narrative. At the same time, state and local governments, especially in places like California, are often operating under a different set of incentives. Many local leaders represent communities with large immigrant populations. Their political survival depends on maintaining trust, minimizing fear, and ensuring that residents feel safe accessing public spaces, schools, and workplaces. When federal operations disrupt that balance, tension becomes inevitable. This is why statements from local officials often sound careful, even restrained. They emphasize protection and concern without directly challenging federal authority. In reality, their power is limited. They cannot stop ICE. They can only respond to the fallout. The timing also coincides with increased pressure on federal agencies to show results. Immigration courts are overwhelmed. Backlogs are enormous. Border debates dominate headlines. In this environment, enforcement within the interior of the country becomes a way to demonstrate action, even if it does not resolve the underlying systemic issues. Another factor is media amplification. In earlier years, similar operations might have gone unnoticed beyond local neighborhoods. Today, every action is recorded, shared, dissected, and debated online within minutes. A single ladder on a roof can become a national symbol by the end of the day. This changes behavior on both sides. Communities are more alert, more anxious, more reactive. Enforcement agencies are more aware that every move will be scrutinized, criticized, or praised depending on the audience. That awareness can sometimes lead to caution, but it can also lead to rigidity. And once a moment goes viral, nuance often disappears. The Montebello incident, despite involving no detentions, quickly became a flashpoint. Not because of what legally occurred, but because of what it represented emotionally. People did not see an enforcement operation. They saw fear. They saw pursuit. They saw instability entering a place that had previously felt routine. That emotional response matters, because public trust is not built on legal briefs or jurisdictional arguments. It's built on whether people believe the system operates predictably, fairly, and humanely. From a political standpoint, this creates risk on all sides. Federal authorities risk alienating communities whose cooperation they may need in the future. Local leaders risk appearing powerless. Advocacy groups risk escalating rhetoric that hardens positions rather than opening dialogue. And residents are left navigating uncertainty with limited information. There is also an international dimension. Immigration enforcement within the United States is watched closely abroad. Images of raids, chases, and fear circulate globally, shaping perceptions of American values and governance. That may not factor into operational decisions, but it does affect the country's image. At its core, this moment reflects a deeper unresolved question. What is the purpose of immigration enforcement? Is it deterrence, compliance, public safety, political signaling, or some combination of all four? Without clarity, every enforcement action becomes a proxy battle over meaning, and when meaning is contested, fear thrives. In the final section, we'll bring all of this together, looking at what this incident tells us about where immigration enforcement is headed, what communities should realistically expect next, and why stories like this are unlikely to fade anytime soon. In the next section, we're going to look closely at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, what agents are allowed to do, where their power stops, and where misconceptions often arise. Because understanding the law is the first step toward understanding whether fear is being driven by reality, perception, or a mix of both. In the next part, we're going to zoom out. We'll examine why Southern California, why now, and how federal immigration enforcement strategies have shifted over time. We'll also look at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, and where the lines, clear or blurred, are supposed to be drawn. Because this story isn't just about one roof, one street, or one neighborhood. It's about what happens when enforcement, fear, and uncertainty collide in public view. What happened in Montebello is not an ending. It's a snapshot of a system under strain. Immigration enforcement will continue. That is a political and legal reality regardless of administration. The question is not whether it happens, but how. And how enforcement is carried out determines whether communities experience it as governance or disruption. If operations continue with high visibility and limited transparency, fear will persist. Workers will withdraw. Neighborhoods will grow quieter. Trust will erode further. If, on the other hand, enforcement shifts toward clearer communication and more predictable boundaries, tension may ease, even if disagreement remains. But right now, uncertainty dominates. The lack of clear information from federal authorities about the scope, targets, and outcomes of these operations leaves room for speculation. And speculation, especially in charged environments, rarely moves in a calming direction. For residents, the immediate future likely looks cautious. People will watch, they will listen, they will adapt their routines. Some will avoid public spaces. Others will rely more heavily on informal networks for information and support. For advocacy groups, organizing will intensify. Documentation, legal challenges, and public messaging will continue. Whether that leads to policy change or deeper polarization remains to be seen. For local officials, the balancing act will remain difficult. They will attempt to reassure communities without confronting federal power directly. Whether those reassurances hold weight will depend on what people experience next, not what they are told. And for federal authorities, every operation now carries added significance, not just legally, but symbolically. The central takeaway from this story is not about a single raid or a single neighborhood. It's about how enforcement shapes behavior, even when no arrests are made. Fear, once introduced, does not need handcuffs to be effective. That is why stories like this resonate. They are not just about law. They are about daily life colliding with authority in unexpected ways. As this situation continues to develop, one thing is clear: immigration enforcement in America is no longer a background process. It is happening in plain sight, and how it unfolds will continue to define not just policy debates, but the lived experience of millions of people. We'll keep watching, because moments like this don't disappear, they evolve. In the next section, we're going to look closely at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, what agents are allowed to do, where their power stops, and where misconceptions often arise. Because understanding the law is the first step toward understanding whether fear is being driven by reality, perception, or a mix of both. In the next part, we're going to zoom out. We'll examine why Southern California, why now, and how federal immigration enforcement strategies have shifted over time. We'll also look at the legal authority ICE actually has during these operations, and where the lines, clear or blurred, are supposed to be drawn. Because this story isn't just about one roof, one street, or one neighborhood. It's about what happens when enforcement, fear, and uncertainty collide in public view.